This is Mark Gunn Media.
Hit it!
Welcome to Gunshots Straight from the Hip. I'm your host, Mark Gunn. The views expressed on this program are those of the host and guests and not necessarily reflective of anyone or any entity associated with this broadcast. This episode: why blacks are not obligated to teach white people about racism. I want to personally thank everybody who has subscribed to the podcast, and remember, you can download it at markgunmedia.com, iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, YouTube, Google Podcasts, envisionradio.com, or wherever you download your podcasts. I also want to thank those of you that listen from anywhere in the U.S. and around the world. Bonjour to our listeners in France. Guten Tag to those of you listening in Germany. To my friends in Ireland. Dia Huch. Apa kabar, Indonesia. Konnichiwa, Japan. To my family in Nigeria. In Leo. Hello to my neighbors to the north in Canada. Hello, Bangladesh. Hola to my friends in Brazil. G'day in Australia. And hello to those of you listening in the UK. We would love to hear from you, and you can reach out to us by going to our website at markgunmedia.com or through envisionradio.com. You know, it occurs to me that in my 59, almost 60 years of life, America's done some amazing things. We've been able to send a man to the moon on multiple occasions. We've been able to find cures for polio. We've made advances in math and science. And even as we speak, we're rolling out a vaccine for the deadliest pandemic to hit this country since 1918. But you know what we've never been able to solve? Racism. America's biggest and oldest sin. Black people have been telling you it's been a problem since, well, longer than I've been alive. There's plenty of evidence of it in your history books, television. Charlottesville, the Black Lives Matter protest this past summer. Even the white guy that was just arrested for murdering 8 people, 6 of them Asians. But as much as we've tried to get you to see the problem, and I have to give credit to some of you because you actually get it, you understand, and you've been doing your part in order to solve this problem. But there are far too many of you that really, honest to God, don't get it, or you're willfully ignorant, or you get it and just don't give a damn. And so what you're starting to see across social media and across the internet, more and more black people like me proclaiming that it is no longer our responsibility to teach you about racism. You've got more than 400 years of your own history to back it up, to learn from. However, in this episode, for those that honestly want to learn, we've got a few experts. But I feel like you do need a reminder as to what racism is and what it isn't.
So let's push through the discomfort. Don't worry, you can do it. We're going to talk about racism.
Well, the dictionary defines racism as the hatred or intolerance of another race or races.
Well, yes, but racism's a little more complicated than that. The dictionary offers a very simple explanation because it's just the dictionary. If you want to understand racism, you need to talk sociology. And sociology explains racism as a combination of prejudice and power.
Well, isn't that just convenient? Let's just ignore what the dictionary says.
No, we're not ignoring the dictionary, just going a little deeper. Think of it this way. If your car breaks down, you don't look up car in the dictionary to try and fix it, you go to a mechanic. So when it comes to getting the nitty-gritty of understanding how racism works, I say we should probably defer to sociologists, because they study how people, organizations, and institutions work. It's kind of their job. So here are 5 things everyone should understand about racism.
Talking about racism is so exhausting. It's like no matter what I do or what I say, someone's gonna call me a racist.
Good people can unintentionally say and do racist things. Racism isn't just burning crosses and racial slurs. It's not always a conscious hatred or dislike. People automatically associate saying something racist with being a bad person. And while we can agree that being racist is bad, good people can say racist things or just wind up supporting racist institutions and practices without even realizing it. Oh, so now it's my fault if I accidentally do something. We're not playing the blame game here, but accidents can still be hurtful. It's important to remember that intent isn't the issue, it's the impact. Like if I accidentally step on your toe, it's an accident, but it still hurts. And I can't just pretend that I didn't step on your foot. I have to acknowledge it, say that I'm sorry, and be more careful with my big ass feet.
If you want to get technical, there's really no such thing as race. We are all the human race. It's a social construct.
Race is a social construct, but that doesn't mean racism isn't real. A social construct is a category, perception, or idea created and developed by society, and then it's applied to individuals or groups. So yes, we're all part of the human race, but the human race did this funny thing where they categorized everyone based on skin tone and regions. Even though social constructs are made up, they're still real. I mean, money is a social construct. Fundamentally, it's just a piece of paper, but it still keeps people up at night and has a huge effect on our day-to-day lives. Marriage, fashion, good and evil, they're all social constructs, but they're still real things. The same is true for race.
White, black, pink, purple, polka dots. I don't know why we need all of these labels. Let's just not see race. Just see everyone the same.
Colorblindness is not gonna fix racism. It's a good idea in theory, but ignoring race is not gonna solve racism. Race isn't the problem. Treating people differently based on race is the problem. It's okay to see my race. I mean, it's kind of hard to ignore how someone looks. There's nothing wrong with seeing our differences. Our differences make us kind of cool.
Okay, but when are we gonna talk about reverse racism?
Reverse racism is not a thing.
I've been bullied, beaten up, and called all sorts of names in my lifetime, and you're gonna tell me that's not racism?
Whoa, that sounds awful. I'm sorry, none of that stuff is okay. But those are examples of racial prejudice, not racism. That's because racism isn't just about individuals, it's about institutional power. Racial prejudice is not cool, but when a person of color discriminates or stereotypes a white person because of their race, in the United States, they don't have the institutional power to back them up and say that those feelings are okay. Institutions are things like schools, government, the military, corporations, and our justice system. All of these things shape how people of color are treated as a group and as individuals. That's because racism is not just on a person-to-person basis. It's big picture things, like people with traditionally Latino or black sounding names having a harder time getting job interviews, even when they have the same qualifications as white people applying for the same job. Or people of color facing harsher prison sentences for petty crimes in comparison to white criminals. It's also harder for people of color to get home loans, on top of housing discrimination that often keeps them out of predominantly white neighborhoods. This is how individual feelings about people of color are supported by institutional power. Prejudice of any kind isn't okay, but it's important to understand that prejudice and racism aren't the same thing.
I never thought about it like that.
Well, you are not the only one. Racism is complicated and overwhelming to think about, even for me. But understanding what racism is and what it isn't is the first step in fighting against it.
You know, one of the things that makes talking about race with white people so frustrating is the instant denial. Oh, it's not race, it's class. Well, I've never seen it, so it doesn't happen. Oh, you're blowing things way out of proportion. Or the tried and true, not all white people, but we'll discuss that later. You heard the term systemic racism mentioned a little bit ago. In case you don't understand exactly what that is.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin, who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better.
One of the other things that's so frustrating when trying to deal with the issue of racism is the silence of a majority of white Americans. As a matter of fact, former Attorney General Eric Holder once called the United States a nation of cowards when it comes to dealing with racism. Why is it so difficult for some of you to talk about this?
It's very uncomfortable to talk about race. It's not something I do.
I am feeling apprehensive because I think there's a lot of reasons why I feel like I should be able to talk about race.
I don't want to say anything, that would offend anyone.
It's a very touchy subject. It's still difficult, even if you feel like you're on the right side of it, to have a dialogue about it.
Especially for white people, because we don't want to see the racism that we may be holding on to.
I don't know. Maybe I am racist. I certainly don't like to think that I am. And I think that's too because the perception, in this society, perception of a racist is a guy in a robe.
Now I understand that it's a system of advantages and disadvantages based on race. So as much as there's the disadvantage piece of it, there's the advantage piece of it, which is what I experience as a white person.
I want to bring up race, and I want to bring it up in a frame that helps my children think that there's no difference. But the mere fact that I might be bringing it up could suggest that there is a difference.
I remember asking a friend of my father's who's black why he was called black, because his skin was brown. And I've learned that lots of people that are white ask this question, and maybe they also received the answer that I got from my parents, which was like, oh my gosh, we're so sorry that she asked that, and it's just a term, like, move on.
I know that I'm white, and I guess I'm part of that collection, but I don't think about being white. I don't.
I really did not know that I had a racial identity. I knew I was white. I had no idea what that meant, how that had shaped my outlook on life, how that had shaped my sense of optimism, sense of belonging, sense of safety, sense of feeling entitled to go help children that I thought were a part of a community that couldn't figure out how to help themselves.
I think that impulse, that kind of colorblindness impulse, comes mostly from white people. Like I've never heard, I mean, I don't know. I'm sure it comes from all people of all kinds, but I've heard it most from white people who are saying like, let's do this as a way of getting past this racism thing. And I think in part it comes from a sense of shame and guilt about what racism has done and kind of how racism was built by white people.
I don't want to be ashamed of being, and plus I'm a male. It's like every group out there can be pissed off at me because I'm white and a male. And that's a weird kind of burden that some people do feel, and I certainly feel it sometimes from people that I'm privileged, I get stuff that other people don't get.
I think we're all implicated in a racist system, and I play my part in it as a white person. So I do have individual responsibility and accountability. I mean, I'm part of the system, and I do things that both perpetuate it, and I try to certainly do things that challenge it.
I realize I've never said anything. When I've heard racist jokes, when I've heard racist comments, I've never said anything. I've never spoken up and said, hey, that's racist. Not once.
In my mind, I'm not involved in any conflict that involves race. I've only been the beneficiary of it. So to talk about it is I don't think I would sound very wise.
Being white means that I have the privilege to think that I'm not affected by racism. Or that I don't even have a race, because I have all these other things like a gender and a sexual orientation, and those are pretty neat, so I don't have a race. But I do, and I'm white.
So while a lot of people are uncomfortable in talking about racism, a lot more of us, black people and people of color, are really uncomfortable in having to deal with it. I've always maintained that racism in this country was a problem created by its white citizens. And to ask the victims of that racism to tell you how to solve it is like asking a rape victim how not to get raped. If you really think about it, honest to God, what sense does that make? Especially since we've been talking about this ad nauseum and your reaction is to be annoyed or dismissive. If racism is going to be an issue that gets resolved in this country, it's going to have to be done by other white people.
To be white in so many ways is to be raised to be functionally illiterate on the topic of race. I am white, and part of being white is that I was not raised to see myself in racial terms. I mean, I understood that somebody had race, but not really me. To be white is to see oneself outside of race, to see oneself as a unique, special individual, exempt from the forces of socialization.
Robin DiAngelo, author of White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, debunks the most common myths white people have about race. Myth number 1, I don't see color.
I'll never forget a moment of standing beside a black man leading a workshop on race, and a white woman said to him, I don't see color. He said, well, then how are you going to see racism? Because I am black. I do think you know that, and I have a different experience than you do. And you're not going to be able to understand that, and you're not going to be able to support the parts of that experience that are really painful and problematic if you refuse to acknowledge my reality. I don't see color is really a way of saying I refuse to acknowledge your reality.
Myth 2, I have black friends.
What's important about that narrative is it reveals what the person thinks racism is. So if the person is using proximity, fondness across race as evidence of a lack of racism, in order for that to be good evidence, a racist must not be able to do that. So that rests on an understanding that a racist cannot tolerate proximity to people of color. And I'm hoping that we can see that's pretty absurd because, trust me, even avowed racists can tolerate being around people of color, and often are.
Race has nothing to do with it. It's about class.
You cannot talk about any other issue without talking about how race informs that issue. And when someone says it's about class, that tends to function as a way to get race off the table.
Another myth, focusing on race is what divides us.
First of all, we're already divided by race. And focusing on race is not what did it. I would say not focusing on race, refusing to grapple with how race shapes virtually everything is what keeps us divided. And that is a very white narrative. All of those narratives function to get race off the table, close the exploration, exempt the person from any further engagement, and protect the racial hierarchy and the white position with it, which is an unequal hierarchy. The challenge I want to offer my fellow white people is changing the question from if to how. So dominant culture asks, if I'm racist. And I want to change that question to how have I been shaped by the forces of racism? How is racism manifesting in my life? Because it circulates 24/7, 365. None of us can be and none of us were exempt from its forces. And this is where individualism can come in. I have a particular story, but that story didn't exempt me. And so I can ask myself, how did all the things I see as unique about me set me up into the overall racist structure? Because it did.
You know, it's been my experience whenever these conversations about racism come up online, there's always some jackwagon that wants proof, some sort of evidence. Well, you know what? No, I'm not doing that. And there's no other black person listening to this that should do it either. Here's why. We've had our entire lifetimes to learn about you and your culture. We've had to unlearn all of the bull that we learned in your American educational system about who we were and our contributions. We've had to dig through the muck to learn the truth about who you are and your true history. So if you want proof that racism exists, or if you want to learn more about what we're saying, you do the damn homework. Google is free. As a matter of fact, author Reni Eddo Lodge wrote a book about this called Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race.
I'm told I was 4 years old when I turned to my mom and I said, well, you know, when am I going to turn white? I was consuming and engaging with media and culture around me, a lot of cartoons, a lot of kids' TV, comics, etc., etc. And well, all the good people were white and I considered myself to be a good person. I realized at that early age that to be white was to be human. I was attempting to discuss race in white-dominated circles and really getting nowhere. I wrote a blog post. I titled it, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. Let's say we were having a broad conversation about inequality. As soon as I tried to raise the topic of race, there was an almost immediate clamp down, shut down, denial from my conversation partner. They tried to find ways to convince me that absolutely no, race had nothing to do with it, that actually I had a chip on my shoulder, and that, you know, why was I trying to make everything about race? Because when you discuss race in the conversation, you become the troublemaker, you become the problem. I dedicated a whole chapter in the book to discussing intersectionality, and it's really from the perspective of my doomed encounters with white British feminism. And they were really doomed because I was surrounded by very nice, white, middle-class women who just didn't want to hear about race. And I was told I'm splitting the movement, I'm being divisive, etc., etc., etc. And that was really a galling time for me because I don't really have the option of separating these two issues. In Britain, power is still very white here. Black and minority ethnic people are about 14% of the population, but that definitely is not reflected in the corridors of power, in who shapes culture, who shapes politics, who shapes the arts. No one's asking the gatekeepers to examine their own prejudices and ask, well, why aren't you recruiting people who are not like you and not from your background? I heard a great quote, and I can't remember who said it, but the person said, you know, you can't ask me why I haven't been invited to the party. You have to ask the host.
If you're sincere about wanting to learn, I highly recommend that you pick up her book. Another book that you may find a little difficult to read but worthwhile is called Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man, written by Emmanuel Acho. The book actually started off as a YouTube series that you can see online right now.
The first question I've seen a lot of, why are you all rioting? I understand protesting, but why riot? And to that I submit this. MLK said that rioting is the language of the unheard. For years, Black people have tried peacefully protesting, going back to 1965 and before with the Selma March, and that didn't work. And then in 2016, Colin Kaepernick, he took a knee, and that agenda got moved to a flag, which was never the goal. He just wanted to raise awareness on social injustice. So that didn't work. And so now we've seen riots because black people and hurt people are trying to get the attention of the oppressor. They're trying to raise awareness of the oppression. I was biking around Lake Austin the other day, and there was a white girl about 15 meters ahead of me. And as I'm on my bike, I say to her, on your left, because I want to notify her I'm coming so that she can change her course of action. I get 10 meters away and I increase my voice, on your left, because she had yet to move. I get 5 meters away and she's still there, and I say, on your left, because I realize if she doesn't change her course of action, there will be a collision. And as I approach her, I yell, on your left, and we collide. My goal was never to hit her, but because she had her headphones in, she didn't hear me, and so she didn't change her course of action. I believe that that's the same thing black people are doing now. 1960s, we're yelling, we're oppressed, but the course of action wasn't changed. And so we again yell, we're oppressed, but the course of action wasn't changed. And so again we yell, we're oppressed. And now you see the collision that's occurred in America. So while I don't condone rioting, and I'm sure you don't either, because for the most part, black people and others that are looting and rioting destructively, they're burning down their own homes. But when you think about the 5 different stages of grief, you come up to one stage, which is called anger. And sometimes emotions, they don't know their actions. You know, another question I get from my white friends, they ask me, why do you think white privilege exists? And I say this, if you and I were in a race, and the official at the start line, they held me back for the first 200 meters. And you had a 200 meter then head start. The only way to level out that race is to either stop you from running or put me on a golf cart and catch you up and catch myself up. Well, you see, what we've done in America is we've simply said, okay, Emmanuel, you're now free to run. And we've acted as if it's a fair race, when in all honesty, black people were held back for hundreds of years. And so if in the late 1960s we say, okay, black people, you can go now, that's not a fair race. LBJ, he said it best when he said, you can't shackle and chain someone for hundreds of years, liberate them to freely compete with the rest, and still justly believe that you've been fair. So white privilege it's having a head start due to hundreds and hundreds of years of systematic and systemic racism. It's having a head start intrinsically built into your life. It's not saying your life hasn't been hard, but what it's saying is your skin color hasn't contributed to the difficulty in your life. I live in an affluent neighborhood in Austin, Texas, and if I ever go to my mailbox and I see a white woman walking up to the mailbox, I consciously sit in my car because I don't want her to feel like I'm a threat. If I'm on an elevator with a white person, I try to hit the button first and get off the elevator first because I don't want them to perceive me as a threat, because I realize at any point in time, whiteness can be weaponized. Amy Cooper, Central Park, the woman who called the cops on a black man who wanted her to leash her dog because it was illegal to walk your dog without a leash. And she used 2 words that are a death sentence for black people. When she called the cops, she said, there's a black man who's threatening my life. Both of those things, as far as when you compile them together, were a lie. Because that black man, he was a bird watcher. And while so many people saw that incident and they were heartbroken, I, as a black man, saw that incident and was reminded of 1955. Emmett Till, 14-year-old boy who was lynched, mutilated, and killed by 2 white men because a white woman made a false claim saying that he flirted with her. In 2017, that white woman recanted that story. In 1956, the 2 white men that killed him, they got off. And they admitted that they did it because they knew they couldn't be charged again due to double jeopardy. That, to me, is white privilege. The ability to weaponize your whiteness and the ability to live life unconsciously. Because I, as a black man, have to calculate every move I make the second I walk outside my house. Another question I get that I'm sure several of y'all have thought, if not your kids have, how come black people can say the N-word, but we can't? I had to do some research on that to educate myself a little bit further. The N-word is synonymous with oppression, execution, and subordination. Black people were so long treated and viewed as no more than the slave to a master. We were viewed as dirt, and that word is synonymous with that. So there is a visceral reaction whenever we hear that word coming out of someone whose complexion is white that reminds us of the pain of our ancestors. Black people took something that was meant and originally used as evil, and we turned it into a term of endearment. So white people, I submit that you can't, shouldn't, and nor should you ever have a desire to say that word, whether quoting a rap song, a movie, or anything. Because remember, that word is truly synonymous with hatred. The abolitionist Frederick Douglass, he wrote when talking about his master that reading and learning would spoil an N-word. Because remember, black people were nothing more than a slave to their master. And when you think about, well, then why are black people saying it? And if I can't say it, then you shouldn't either, black person. We've been oppressed for so long, our rights have for so long been limited, that for you to now try to again limit our speech, it's painful.
Here's the bottom line. Black people have done the heavy lifting when it comes to this issue, and frankly, we're sick and tired of it. We're tired of being your encyclopedia when it comes to dealing with an issue that we didn't create. It's time for you to do the work. Besides, what choice do you really have? You've been listening to Gunshots Straight from the Hip. The views expressed are those of the host and guests and not reflective of any business entity or anyone associated with this broadcast. If you have any comments or want more information on how to be a sponsor, log on to our website at markgunmedia.com or call us at 502-407-0283. That's 502-407-0283. Thank you for listening.
Mark Gun Media. No hype, no hoopla, just damn good work.